Hi, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about Christopher Marlowe, William Shakespeare, and Sir Philip Sidney. So let's just jump right in. So first, let's start with Christopher Marlowe. He's got a pretty fascinating biography. So he's born in 1564, lived till 1593. He's the son of a shoemaker, and he ended up being a scholarship student at Cambridge, right? So he has like a little bit more of a humble background than Sidney, who we'll talk about later. Um, but he did have that Cambridge education. He worked as a secret agent. And this is, I mean, probably there's not a whole lot of record of exactly what his work was, which historians say is maybe further proof that he was a secret agent. But he was accused of being a Catholic, which was a heretical, you know, belief system at the time, and there was a lot of tension around that religious, between Protestants and Catholics at the time in England. And so he was actually denied his degree at Cambridge until someone from the Privy Council stepped in and said that he's been doing service for the Queen and that they should not be interfering because they're ignorant of the ways that he's serving the country. So anyway, so we have a feeling that he's probably a spy working for Protestants. And anyway, he did live a very short life. And at the age of 29, he died in a brawl. And there's some speculation about maybe this was related to his work as a spy, but also it's not the first fight he got in. And so we kind of don't know exactly, but we just know that he lived a very short life, didn't even make it to 30. Okay, and so despite that, he was pretty prolific. So if we look at Dr. Faustus, so this is a story that is based on, there's folklore motifs of, and kind of involving um, this trade of your soul or trade of your, trade for power. And in the case, and it's also based on a German text. In this story, we have Faustus. He's basically achieved his highest level of education. He's getting his doctorate, and he realizes that he's completely like disenchanted with scholarly knowledge, right? And he kind of, I love the passage where he's kind of listing, he's like, philosophy's worthless, divinity's the worst, knowledge of all. And so he's really just kind of ticking through, medicine is boring. And he says what he really wants is to learn magic. He thinks magic is going to be like kind of the knowledge that really fulfills him. And especially it's a forbidden knowledge, right? And so I think it has that appeal, that lure. Um, and he's kind of achieved everything else, all of his other goals related to knowledge. He wants more, right? He's not satisfied. So he learns magic. He has a couple of friends help him. He summons a devil and he asks the devil to serve him. And the devil says, I'm sorry, I can't. I work for Lucifer. Maybe you've heard of him. And so Faustus is like, okay, that makes sense. How about you work for me for 24 years and basically like do magic to make my life better, ruin the lives of my enemies, make my friends' lives better, give me what I want. And then when we're done with that, Lucifer can have my soul. Does that sound good? And he's like, you go talk to him and then come back. And then he ends up making a deal. He signs the contract with blood. And then from here, we have sort of a breakdown into a plot where, they're playing tricks on people. There's like a point where he's kind of torturing a clown until the clown agrees to serve him and things like that. Just kind of a bunch of like evil, but still kind of funny. I mean, comic is probably the right word. Comic hijinks. And eventually he does conjure Helen of Troy. And that's, by the way, where we get that famous line, is this the face that, what is it? Is this the face that sailed 1,000 ships? And there's some interesting writing about that line, by the way, if that's something that you're interested in, about what that means, if he is criticizing Helen's beauty, if Mephistopheles, the devil who shows up, has changed his appearance to be Helen, or if Helen was actually conjured. There's a lot written about this. And then finally, at the end of the story, Faustus regrets his action of selling his soul. But at this point, and he does confess to some of the scholars around him who were kind of suspicious that something was going on with him. He confesses to the scholars that he sold his soul, and they're like, well, repent, you can still be saved. And he's like, I physically cannot repent because I sold my soul to Lucifer, and I like cannot say that I confess my sins or anything. I can't. I'm completely cut off from God, which is, kind of like the Mephistopheles talks earlier in the play about how that's like the worst thing that could happen, right? And he's like, can we not talk about it because it's so painful or whatever? Anyway, and then at the end of the story, Faustus is dragged to hell, right? He has to fulfill his bargain. So probably not surprising, this story falls in the category of a tragedy, right? And I think this is our first tragedy we're reading. So this is going to be, I wanted to make sure we get a definition. It's a dramatic representation of the fall of the hero, beginning in happiness and ending in catastrophe. So we have at the beginning of Faustus, and this is a kind of a straight to the point type play, right? There's not a whole lot of in between necessarily, but at the very very beginning, he's happy because he's achieved high success. He's not happy, and then he has a long time where he has like ultimate power and can basically get whatever he wants, which is supposed to make him happy, but it's not making him happy really. Um, anyway, and so it's maybe a not perfect representation of a tragedy, but it certainly is in the way that it has such a terrible, terrible ending, right? Okay, so then the conflict in this story is really interesting because compared to other tragedies, if we look at like Greek tragedies, for example, the tragedy here is going to be very internal. It's really about him battling with himself. He really wants this power, but he also recognizes that he is going to have to make a trade for that power. And we know by the end of the play that he regrets that trade. And the conflict here then is between tradition, which is a kind of a common theme with tragedies, and the new Renaissance individualism, right? And so this is a commentary. This is very much from the perspective of somebody writing from the Renaissance, where individualism is just like so much a part of the virtues. They're so focused on individual uh, success, individual growth, individual um, positives. So, one of the reasons I wanted to point that out about this tragedy is it's considered the first Christian tragedy. And so, even though we have a lot of Christian, ideology involved here, really the reason for this is more to do with this battle internally, this internal battle where he has, given away his soul. And so, if you want to learn more about that, I've included some links to Britannica where they talk about it. I thought it was really interesting. If we look at the form of this, so it's going to be written in blank verse and prose. Blank verse is going to be used when we are, for things like the soliloquies, which I'm going to get to in a second. So most of the play is going to be written in um, the main parts of the play are going to be written in blank verse. When we get into the more comic sections, like scene 2, that is actually going to be written. And you might have noticed the structure, depending on the text that you're reading, the structure of the text changes. Or if you're listening to it, then you'll hear that the way that it's being read, it's losing its meter. And that's because blank verse is going to be unrhymed pentameter, unrhymed iambic pentameter, right? And so what that means is that we have this like, kind of we're hearing like these 5 beats, and that's kind of the cadence that it's being spoken at. And then with prose, though, we're going to lose that meter. In poetry, so I wanted to make sure I defined iambic pentameter. I don't think we've come across it yet. It was really even in his we're going to look at Sidney's work. Sidney is working with sort of a pre-iambic pentameter and a lot of his sonnets. So in poetry, a line of verse composed of 10 syllables arranged in 5 metrical feet. So that's what I'm talking about. It's like when you're reading it, you'll be able to kind of notice the stress where you'll kind of have if you're kind of tapping your foot, if you have a musical background, you'll kind of maybe know what I'm talking about here, where you can kind of hear the rhythm of it. You can feel the rhythm, sense the rhythm of the words, because there's going to be an emphasized or stressed syllable and an unstressed syllable. Okay, so it goes unstressed, then stressed, unstressed, then stressed. Another term I wanted to make sure you knew this week is chorus. And so what this is, it's a group of performers who comment on the main action, typically speaking and moving together. If you've read Greek plays, then you probably have come across choruses before. And one of the things I thought was interesting that I don't think I've thought about much is that in Elizabethan drama, this is typically going to be a single character who speaks the prologue and other linking parts of the play. Another way of thinking about this, and I think the way that maybe I have typically thought of this is as a narrator. They are going to kind of fill in any gaps, let us know if time has passed, give us a little bit of a sense of context. And so the chorus, sometimes it can really it feels very different from the rest of the play because it is such a different perspective, but it's giving us a lot of information that can be really important. And then the final term that I wanted to tell you is soliloquy. And this is going to be a really important term for this week and next week. This is going to be a monologue in which a character, and I mean, and also future weeks, but these two in particular, a monologue in which a character in a play expresses thoughts and feelings while being alone on stage. And so here they're telling us what they're thinking about, the decision they're trying to make, how they might be struggling. And this is going to be important, especially if we're thinking about kind of Renaissance thinking. Again, it's going to be about a lot of it is going to be about this internal conflict because we're dealing with this new focus on individualism. Um, and so it's going to be really important thinking about the individual characters and what's going on inside their brain instead of necessarily the actions going on around them, although those will also be relevant, right? All right. So I wanted us to also read The Passionate Shepherd to His Love. I think this is one of the better pastoral poems, and it's also very short. And so some of the pastorals that we've skipped over some. We've skipped over Spenser's pastoral. We skipped over Piers Plowman. Those are good, and if you want to go back and read those, they can give you a good sense of what earlier pastorals poetry sounded like. But remember when I was talking about Spenser, I said part of the reason Spenser started with writing a pastoral poem is that this was part of becoming like a great poet, and he really wanted to be like this national poet, right? And so we also have one of these from Marlowe. It's much less ambitious. It's very short. And it's also, it's very popular. It's been set to music. I included some sheet music here. We have a response to it from Sir Walter Raleigh. And so, yeah, we have a lot to learn from this one. But basically, when we're looking at a pastoral, this is going to be something that is set in, kind of out in rural life. And there's usually going to be like shepherds, and they're leading these virtuous lives, and they have this like, beautiful love story. They have some, person that they're writing to that they love or whatever. And pastoral is usually going to be a way of kind of contrasting sort of like more of like an intellectual lifestyle or whatever with or urban lifestyle with a more rural lifestyle. And this might be an interesting way too if you've read or learned much about the Romantic era in British literature. Thinking ahead, they're also going to do this idealization of this like pure lifestyle of the rural and unspoiled nature. And so we're seeing an earlier version of that, right? So for English poets, this involves imagining retreating from the trappings of modernity to the imagined virtues and romance of rural life. It's almost reminding me of like cottagecore, right? And then this one is going to be written in iambic tetrameter, which is going to be a four metrical feet meter. And this is going to be the other most common type of verse meter in English poetry. So we're going to be reading a lot of iambic pentameter. That one's the most popular, probably, or I think probably is a good word, maybe certainly. But this one is going to be also popular, not quite as popular. All right. Let's go ahead and move on to Shakespeare. I want to briefly touch on Shakespeare's biography this week because we're going to go a lot deeper next week. But basically, he's a contemporary with Marlowe. He was born the same year. I think it's 2 months later, but he lived a little bit longer. He lived till 1616. His father was successful in business and government pursuits, so he had like a maybe like a little bit more um, privilege, maybe, I'm not sure, than Marlowe. We actually really don't know a ton about Shakespeare's life, um, which is kind of funny. I mean, we know as much as we possibly could, but he has some mystery surrounding him, and so we like don't know where he went to school, for example. We think we know. Um, but we don't, there's like a lot of gaps. So basically, his dad was successful in business and government, and then he ends up kind of having a big turn, a big downfall, and it might be related to the fact that he was Catholic. Like I said, that's a very heretical kind of religious faith at the time, very contentious. There's wars being fought about it, at this time period. Um, so Shakespeare did not go to Cambridge or Oxford, which is kind of interesting. He's going to be sandwiched in this week's lesson right between two people who went to Cambridge and then Oxford, respectively. Um, and so we really, like I said, we don't know a whole lot about his education, which is maybe surprising because he's so prolific and he's so celebrated that you would think he'd have some like amazing pedigree. We're like, oh wow, he went to all these schools and whatever. And it's like we really don't know where he went. And it seems from what most scholars seem to agree is that a lot of what he learned through being in theater troupes um, and from his grammar school education, which would have taught him Latin and other things. He did get married. He was married at 18 to Anne Hathaway, who was like 8 years older than him, and then they had two daughters and a son, Hamnet, which you might recognize that name as just one letter off from another significant name. Um, Hamnet died at 11, and we don't know how he died, but I mean, it does seem to be kind of a significant event, and people look, I mean, obviously, right? I don't mean to be callous when I say that, but people look at how that influenced Shakespeare's life, and there's some interest in why Shakespeare's writing was more comic and or like his poetry, his sonnets that we're going to read this week were maybe a little bit more happy. And then there's like kind of a dark turn. And so some people speculate about why that might be. Mystery surrounds his life. Like Marlowe, there's a lot we don't know about him, but there's a lot of speculation. He has lost years. There's like a series of years where we don't really know what was going on. There's some talk that maybe he had gotten in trouble for poaching and had to flee town. And then he also has a cryptic will, which is pretty famous. I think we'll talk about that more next week. So I want to talk about his sonnets. So when we talk about these sonnet sequences, and maybe I should go ahead and skip ahead. Um, no. Yeah. He has these sonnet sequences, which are a group of sonnets that are sharing the same subject matter and sometimes a dramatic situation or in persona. What's kind of interesting about Shakespeare sonnets is that we don't actually know if he intended for them to be published. It seems like nobody asked if he wanted them to be published before publishing them. And the dedication on his sonnets is from his publisher and not him. He doesn't sign it, and we're not sure who the dedication is to. We assume it's Shakespeare's patron, but we don't know. Um, and so what we're looking at when we're looking at Shakespeare sonnets in terms of that content is we're looking at these two characters. So the first character, the character who arguably takes up um, most of the sonnets, is the fair youth. This is a man, and he is supposed to be very beautiful, young. He's the principal object of praise, love, and idealizing devotion. And what some people will talk about as interesting about Shakespeare's sonnet sequence is how this is unusual, because usually the object of affection is going to be a woman, and like this very like idealized, pure young woman. So we're seeing all of that idealized pure young, but a man. Okay. Um, and so there's some differing opinions about how many of the poems in the sequence are actually towards the fair youth. There's, I think, only 30 that are explicitly naming gender. And so we know that those are for the fair youth. But then we usually attribute 1 through 126 to the fair youth sequence. The first 17 are called the procreation sonnets, which every single time I have to say that, I do a double take. I'm like, that can't be right. But what they are is they are pressing this young man to marry and have children. And it's all about this like obsession with time and this idea that if you don't marry and have children, you're going to have no legacy, you'll be forgotten. And after the 17th sonnet, Shakespeare, it seems like he, takes a breath and he kind of relaxes a little bit, and they become more just purely devotional poems. And the other thing that's kind of interesting about them at this point is that um, he talks a little bit about how the sonnets themselves, the fair youth is going to live on through the sonnets themselves. They work as his legacy. And so him marrying and having children is not necessarily as much of the focus point. By the way, this is the person who they speculate is the fair youth, and I'm blanking on his name. It's William something. Um, but I had to include this picture because this cat looks so angry. But he was Shakespeare's patron, and so that's the assumption here. There's also another character that appears through a lot of the sonnets. This is the Dark Lady, and so the Dark Lady sequence is 127 to 152. It's shorter. Again, we think. It's not, there's a lot of poems that don't have a specified gender, so we're not totally sure. But you can usually tell the Dark Lady sequence because the tone shift is so pronounced. In these sonnets, we see a dark, sensuous, and sexually promiscuous mistress rather than this usual chaste and aloof blonde beauty. Um, and so the tone here is really different. And I read a really interesting essay that I might recommend down here. There's a link to it where the writer's kind of talking about how there's so much contrast here between the way that Shakespeare talks about the fair youth, and it seems like it's really written from a position of love. And with the Dark Lady, it's really more about kind of like an erotic passion, and not necessarily love. And also, he sees this fair youth as idealized, and then the Dark Lady seems much more like grounded, down to earth, and potentially even has like somewhat of a negative connotation. So going into the form though, so what we're looking at here is a Shakespearean sonnet. So it's his own form that he's created. This is also the English sonnet, and it's going to be very much based on other sonnet forms that we're going to talk about in a second. But sonnets are going to be 14 lines. So his are three quatrains and a concluding couplet. And so the rhyme scheme is going to be A B A B, C D C D, E F E F, G G. And when I say quatrain, what I mean by that is a 4-line stanza. So he's going to have three of those and then one couplet at the very end. And the couplet just means a pair of successive rhyming lines, usually of the same length. These are typically, and you might have noticed this when you're reading them, especially compared to Sidney's sonnets. The meter and the rhyme is just so easy to read. It really has a great rhythm to it. And so I think that's part of the reason why these have just like lasted so long, is that they really just roll off the tongue, even though the language might be like a little bit archaic and stuff at times. They just seem, they're very easy to read because of that meter and rhyme scheme. All right, and then I wanted to point out a couple of noteworthy lines in significance. So Sonnet 18 is probably the most famous. It starts, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate." This is the first poem in the Fair Youth sequence after the procreation sonnets. And so it's the first one where he seems like he's kind of taking a breath and he's like, okay, let's move on from me insisting that you have kids. Um, and these are really more just dedicated to praising him and expressing devotion and talking about his timeless beauty. Sonnet 130 is another one that I wanted to point out. This one I think is interesting because of the way that it is so kind of ironically employing the conventions of Petrarchan sonnets, and we're going to talk about those in the next slide. But if you kind of picked up on some of this, the tone of this poem is a little weird. He's kind of negative, and I don't necessarily mean negative in terms of like bad. I mean negative in terms of like he's saying what someone is not. So he says, "My mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun." right? Coral is far more red than her lips red. If snow be white, why then her breasts are done. If hairs be wires, black wires grow on her head. And so he's kind of saying, like, she's not this, right? And this is an anti-Petrarchan sonnet, and the speaker is affording her ironic praise by inverting and undermining unrealistic sonnet compliments, right? And let's talk about some of those ironic sonnet compliments. What we have when we're looking at kind of the um, great great grandfather of these sonnets is the Petrarchan sonnet. And so this is going to be, or the Italian sonnet is another word for this. The form is going to be different. It's going to be the first 8 lines are an octave. They state the problem, right? And so it's going to be kind of like instead of having 3 quatrains, or yeah, we're going to have an octave. And so it's going to be like a kind of a bigger chunk, um, and ask a question or express an emotional tension. The last 6 lines, or the sestet, resolve the problem, answer the question, or relieve the tension. Okay. And so Shakespeare's is also going to be like that, but he has 3 quatrains, and then the couplet is going to be kind of the resolution. The sestet is a much heftier piece of the poem, right? And so it's going to be a little bit more complex. So the octave rhyme is going to be it's A, B, B, A, or I just always think ABBA, ABBA. And then the sestet rhyme is actually going to vary. So it can be something like C, D, E, C, D, E, C, D, C, C, D, C, or C, D, E, D, C, E. And I might have mentioned this already, but when we're talking about rhyme schemes, just keep in mind that all of these letters that are the same, like A's, they're all going to have the same rhyme ending. So it's all going to have the same sound at the end, excuse me, of the line, even if it's in like a separate part of the sonnet. So if you see the letter repeated, then that means it's going to be that same exact sound throughout. And so B's are going to be all rhyming, C's are going to be rhyming D's, E's. That's what that means. And if you want to read more about rhyme schemes and things, I also have some links in here. In terms of the content of a Petrarchan sonnet, this is what Shakespeare is really working with and being ironic about and anti, is we have a poet who is kind of longing for a woman who seems sort of disinterested. Okay. And I thought this was a great a great illustration. So I wanted to include that. And we're seeing courtly love here again too. Nobles who are he's trying to win her through some sort of like acts, and meanwhile she's like, waiting for him to prove himself worthy or something. Okay, and then the other thing that we might note about Petrarchan sonnets, and we're going to see these in Sidney's work for sure, is going to be exaggerated comparison or a striking oxymoron. So one of the common ones is comparing her eyes to the sun. And if you remember in that last in 130 from Shakespeare, he is directly turning that on his head, right? My mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun. They also put together love and pain. And so those are things that don't really seem similar, but they are put together in these kinds of sonnets, right? Dramatic, just very dramatic in every way. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on to Sir Philip Sidney. He is a little bit earlier. He is 1554, so I think that's 10 years earlier than our previous poets, to 1586. I love this quote from the Norton anthology. It says, "Knight, soldier, poet, friend, and patron. He was Castiglione's perfect courtier come to life." So, there's sort of an idealized vision of Sidney. And I mean, the Norton isn't saying this like without any kind of objectivity. This is a portrayal of how he was perceived. And if you're not familiar with Castiglione's Perfect Courtier, you might want to check this out. It's kind of interesting. But there's kind of these ideas for how to almost like etiquette, almost like teaching virtues, right? How to be noble. So Sir Philip Sidney certainly was noble. His father was thrice Lord Deputy of Ireland. His mother was the sister of the Earl of Leicester, I guess that was Queen Elizabeth's favorite, supposedly. Both of them, he's the godson of Philip II of Spain. So he has all of these connections to royalty. I think my favorite thing about his biography is actually that he and Queen Elizabeth didn't seem to get along very well, which is so weird because it's like, how do you have like how do you have conflict with a queen, especially in this time period where people were absolutely killed over, over these kinds of conflicts and differences. But it seems more like it was more like squabbling than it was like major political or something conflicts. So he went to Oxford and he did not finish his degree. Instead, he's coming from money. So he takes the opportunity to travel the continent. And this was honestly like a really important rite of passage for a lot of these poets. If you had the means, because you were able to go to places like, I think Italy probably being the most important, but places that are on the continent have these great traditions of poetry and literature that people wanted to emulate and they wanted to learn more about. And so if you were able to, that is going to be your gateway into success as an English poet. And Sidney was very influenced by Italian poetry. Okay, so finally, he also lived a very short life, you might notice. He's only 32 when he died, and he was killed in battle in Spain fighting the Protestant cause. And he was so basically because of the way he died, he was so dedicated to defending Protestantism, and this was part of why he had conflicts with Elizabeth, that uh, he was really revered for this. He was really celebrated. And so his poetry ends up becoming more famous after he dies, as he has this sort of heroic image in Britain. And I hope I'm not getting this wrong. What I read in one of his biographies was that his dad basically almost went bankrupt throwing his funeral because it was such a huge national event in Britain. This guy was so celebrated. All right. So let's talk about Astrophil and Stella. I love looking at Astrophil and Stella right after Shakespeare because if you read about the sonnet sequences, one of the things that you might read is that Astrophil and Stella is considered the best sonnet sequence after Shakespeare, which is, um, it's still huge praise, right? But it's like it always says something like that. Like it's really good. It's just not quite as good as Shakespeare's, which is interesting too, because we don't even know if Shakespeare's sonnet cycle is like in the order that he wanted, or if he even wanted it published. So this is the first Elizabethan sonnet sequence. It's 108 sonnets and 11 songs. And this one is particularly Petrarchan in its conventional depiction of unrequited love. We have the aloof Stella and the suffering Astrophil. And I love, again, this image, I think is pretty indicative of the vibe here. She is like not even looking at this flower that he's handing her or looking at him. She's staring off into the distance and he's like looking at her, trying to judge if she's noticing him. So there's been speculation that Stella is based on Penelope Devereux, and it seems like Sidney was trying to allude to her. Like there are allusions in the sequence, but what I would want to mention is that I think most people don't see this as like some sort of like very true depiction. It's still very much like a persona that he's putting on. It's like his Sasha Fierce, where he's like, I'm Astrophil, she's Stella. And so it's still very like fictionalized, it seems. Both of them, they were betrothed as children, and they're both from noble families. So this was like a power move. It's not like, they fell in love or anything like that. And so then they ended up marrying different people. And it doesn't seem like that probably was a problem for anybody, but I mean she does seem to have been unhappy in her marriage, but it doesn't seem like he was like pining for her necessarily. At least in the biographies that I've read, they're like, be cautious about taking this too much as like a biographical type of or autobiographical type of poem. And I wanted to point out a couple of the sonnets. So the first one, Sonnet 1, is one of the more famous ones. It's written in hexameters, which I wanted to point out. This is not necessarily the most common verse structure. And so if it felt a little weird to you when you're reading it, maybe that's why. Metrical lines of 6 feet, most often dactylic and found in classical Latin or Greek poetry. And so again, he traveled the continent. He has all of this admiration for these, more traditional poems. I would say another thing that's interesting about this sonnet is it's meant to persuade. It is rhetorical, it's stating its purpose. He wants her to read these poems and to be inspired to fall in love through the course of reading them. And so yeah, I think that's kind of interesting. The other thing I wanted to point out is that at the end of this sonnet, he does an invocation to the muse. And so this is going to be a very traditional thing that we'll see in poetry. We're definitely going to see more of this. And what this is it's an address to a deity or muse, in this case, that often takes the form of a request for help in composing the poem at hand. Okay, so he's literally saying in this sonnet, he's like, I'm in love. I want to declare my purpose. I'm having writer's block. He says, my brain is sunburned, which I think is even more relevant to us here. And so he's asking for the muse's help in writing these persuasive sonnets, right? And then Sonnet 63, I wasn't actually going to choose this one. It's not necessarily one of the most famous sonnets. What I liked about this, though, is that there's an incredible essay written about it by Malenko that you can find on Poetry Foundation. I linked to it here. So if you want to do a little bit more of a deeper dive into like sonnets and especially into Sidney's sonnets, um, I thought this was so interesting. But what I think would also be good to note about 63 is it is a more traditional Petrarchan form poem. And so we have the Abba Abba of the octave, that rhyme scheme. And then we also have the sestet. And this one didn't follow any of those patterns that I listed in the first one. It's C, C, D, E, E, D. But again, it's pretty similar. And I also thought this one was a really good example of the volta, which is the turn of thought or argument. So when we get to the sestet, or in Shakespeare's case, the couplet, we're going to notice there's like a solution being presented for the problem. I thought this was a really good one because it really is like she keeps, basically it's about she's rejecting him, and he's saying he's personifying grammar, and then he's recognizing that if she's using a double negative, then that's actually a positive. Honestly, this poem kind of gives me an ick because it sounds like it's a little problematic in terms of consent. And we're gonna see this play out with some of the other Petrarchan types of poems where you're kind of, if the object of your affection is disinterested and even somewhat hostile towards you, you can't just like the answer is probably not to just keep writing and trying over and over again, right? So there's kind of this energy that's absolutely not aged well. And I think even Shakespeare was like, this is gross. And so if you read his sonnets, you can see how he's critical of this approach. Um, but yeah, I wanted to show you kind of the first sonnet sequence and give you a nice idea of how this compares to Shakespeare, and some of the other poetry that we'll read later in the semester. All right, this was it for this week. I will see you all next week.